Okay, the recording is on. Other co-hosts, if you want to also record, that's not a bad, I don't know if that helps or hurts or if you can or can't, but might
We
get
can't.
You can, okay. All right, good. So let's begin with some introductions here. Want to welcome everyone to our webinar series. It's called The Matrix, Conversations and Transformations. And it's brought to you by the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice at Occidental College in Los Angeles. I'm joined by the co-organizers of the series, Professor Mary Christianakis, who's chair of the Critical Theory Social Justice Department, and Professor Caroline Heldman, who will be Master of Ceremonies today. The series focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists from around the world. Our aims for the series are three, basically: to lead conversations that help all of us better understand the problems we're facing, to help us develop plans to transform ourselves and the conditions that give rise to those problems, and then finally, to identify actions we can take now to make meaningful and real change. This summer, our series will address two main crises: the complex and far-reaching effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll approach those from a number of different angles, and political violence, in particular, the violence of US policing forces against Black people in our country and its broad effects in our society. We have two upcoming events, not this next week, but the week after. On Monday, June 22nd, Maritza Agundez of the Coalition for Humane Immigrants' Rights, CHIRLA, will discuss the impact of the COVID pandemic and crisis on immigrant communities. Then that same week, on Wednesday, June 24th, Anastasios Angelopoulos, a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and biomedical technology inventor and entrepreneur, just on the side, no big deal, will talk about the difficulties and traps of COVID-19 data and modeling, and his talk is titled Dark Data and COVID-19. So we'll be having these colloquia, these webinars throughout the summer. Registration links for all of them can be found at this shortcut URL, oxy.edu/matrix, oxy.edu/matrix. And we're recording these events, and we'll make them available in the future via that same website. And also, if you want to follow along with our work in the department, you can check us out on Instagram at CTSJ Oxy, CTSJOXY. So today we're very honored to have as our guest Professor Joanne Freeman, who will be talking about political violence and pandemic in the context of US history. And to introduce her and lead our conversation, I'll turn over the mic to Professor Heldman.
Thank you, Professor Malik. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Joanne Freeman. She is a US historian and professor of history and American studies at Yale University. Joanne, or Dr. Freeman, is considered the leading expert on the life and legacy of Alexander Hamilton. Her work has actually, we'll put featured, we'll use the word featured in the musical Hamilton. She's also published 2 books as well as numerous op-eds for the New York Times, the Atlantic, Slate, and many academic journal articles. In 2005, she was rated as one of the top young historians in the US, and she is frequently called upon to give commentary on cable news networks and other outlets on the current state of political affairs. Her latest book, entitled The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, was the New York Times notable book selection of 2018, and the book was also a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. So we are going to start off with the first big question, right? The "Are we doomed?" question, Dr. Freeman. So you have actually been very public on Twitter. And by the way, if you don't follow her on Twitter, you should follow her on Twitter for your daily dose of both optimism and pessimism and some history at the forefront. But you've stated publicly that historians are unusually perplexed by the contemporary socio-political landscape, right? Why is this, and are we doomed?
Okay. As far as the feelings that I think a lot of historians have
right now. And I obviously am speaking for myself, but in engaging with a lot of colleagues, I think we all share this. On the one hand, we're thinking like historians. So we're thinking about patterns, and we're thinking about the past, and we're looking and sort of maybe not predicting what comes next, but sort of surveying the scene from a step back. But as Americans and as people in this moment, certainly I am not, and I know a lot of my colleagues are not capable of being that detached. So on the one hand, one voice in my head wants to step forward and say, but wait, we need to be thinking about X, Y, and Z. And if we look at X, Y, and Z in the past, we can learn this. Another part of me is just alarmed. And so I think we're in such a distinctive kind of a moment where there are so many things that have come together in such a strange kind of a way. I don't think any historian can quite say, has there been a moment like this before? In some ways, I would say there hasn't been this collection of things that are bouncing off against each other in quite this way. So that leaves historians sort of grappling around, trying to get a grounding to offer some kind of feedback while still feeling very much like all of us, I think, somewhat at sea on a daily basis as to what's coming next. Now, go ahead.
When you say all of these things have converged, Dr. Freeman, what specific elements are you talking about happening right now? If you could just bring us the list.
Oh, sure, and it'll even be a partial list. So of course, I'm partly talking about the fact that there's a worldwide pandemic, about the fact that there's economic crisis and suffering because of it. Also, obviously, the fact that we have an administration in power right now that has been churning through and discarding norms and has had an interesting way of engaging with or not engaging with structures of government, has kind of a conflicted or complicated relationship with the Constitution and constitutional processes. And I would say, amidst all of that, the pandemic has done this, this administration has done this, then you have the question of race, right? The pandemic has exposed it to people, I think, who haven't seen it in the way that we're seeing it now before. Largely white Americans, I think, have not experienced it in this way. And I think one of the distinctive things about this moment is that the collection of pandemic, economic crisis, and political issues means that everybody is engaged in this moment in a way that doesn't always happen. People of all stripes and all political stripes and all races are all engaged in a personal way in this moment. Whether or not they choose to engage with the question of race right now is a separate issue. But I think everyone in one way or another feels aware of what's going on in this moment and is trying to process it. And that's a distinctive kind of a thing. Now, as far as your doomed question, I think it's a good starting place and maybe then a good ending place. I think it's a good starting place because I think it's very easy to be in this moment and do two things. And one of them is to say, we're doomed. It's done, right? Nothing is going to go well. It's all going to be bad from here on in. The republic is going to collapse. There'll be no improvement in the realm of racism. I think that's one way to think about this moment. Another way, I think, which is equally unhelpful, is, well, it's all going to be okay because it's always been okay before. I don't think either one of those approaches is useful, and I think both of those approaches mask what is the most helpful way to look at this moment, and that is, we're in a moment of extreme contingency. And what that means is that things are still in process. They're still in action. And what matters more than anything else is our alertness and awareness about what's going on around us and the actions that we choose to take. And if we think it's going to be okay, or if we think that it's all over, those are invitations to not take action, to not be alert, to not be aware. And I think that would, in a sense, be the most dangerous thing that anyone can do in this current moment.
Thank you. And there is a question, a follow-up question. Would you add climate crisis to that list?
I would. It's a good question. I didn't list it immediately because I suppose it doesn't feel like the avalanche of things that fell on us almost at one moment, but for sure. You know, it's why I said my list wasn't going to be complete. There are so many things sort of intermesh with each other and building on each other at this moment. The climate is part of it. The fact that that I could make that list and not include that on my first sweep through kind of tells you the number of things that we're facing now, because that's obviously an enormous one. And it was, you know, my fourth or my fifth as opposed to my first. But yeah, I think that's absolutely, and that's yet another example of something that affects everybody, right? Some people might be in denial about one or another aspect of what's going on right now, but all of these things affect everybody.
So, thank you. So for those of you who aren't yet used to this new webinar thing that we're doing, maybe it's one of your first ones, the way these are set up is if you have questions, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the window, and you should be able to just type in a question. And then the moderators, so that's all of us, will make sure to address those as they come up, okay? So, Caroline, do you want to say something?
Another question has come in from Dave Airy. Would you add income inequality to that list?
Yes. But in a way, yes, and I would also lump that in with the particular administration that we have and the tradition that it's plugging into. But yes, I think that's part of what's, I mean, it's hard, I don't know how to communicate the fact that the long list of things that is intermingled right now, you know, we've had, speaking as a historian and taking the broad perspective, there have been other moments of extreme contingency. There have been other moments that have been great crises. There has not been a moment where this particular combination of things has been in flux and has been in a state of crisis at the same time. So yeah, I absolutely would. And one of the things that I think is happening because of all those things being engaged with each other is that failures and gaps and holes and problems are being exposed in an extreme kind of a way. And that's also some of what people are experiencing right now, I think.
Okay. So I've got a more specific question that's not a lot more specific, but moving us in a direction. And it's about political violence. So as an expert on the history of political violence, it's got 3 parts here. What can you tell us about the risk of violence in our current context? And how might the 2020 election contribute to that risk? And then finally, what do you think about the concerns some people are raising that it feels like we're heading for a civil war? Just to add to the doom.
Yeah, wow, definitely. Well, okay, so speaking generally, I guess I would say, is there potential for violence? Yes. And I think that's true regardless of what happens in the election. I think that's possible. And I say that not, actually very much not speaking of this moment, but looking more broadly. There have been other moments in time, and I write a lot about political culture and political violence, so these moments tend to sort of leap up in my work. But there have been other moments in history where I think Americans have a sense that some direction is being chosen or some fundamental issue is being debated or something is in the air that feels more significant than more conventional politics. I think, you know, looking all the way back to the period that I really specialize in, I think in the late 1790s, the debate was about democracy and how democratic a republic this was going to be, and that was very much in the air. Extreme polarization, violence, conspiracy theories, and then an election in which people were arming in case the election didn't go the way that they wanted it to go in 1800, right? You could say that the pre-Civil War era is another one of those moments. You could say that the Civil Rights era in the 1960s is another one of those moments. And, you know, the Civil War era obviously is slavery. The Civil Rights era is about that very question about rights and who has what rights. And we're in another moment right now, which in a way is about citizenship and what it means to be a citizen and who gets to be a citizen and what rights everyone should have as a citizen. In a way, that's kind of what's being debated right now. So in all of those kinds of moments, extreme polarization and the possibility of violence interestingly, also in all of those moments, typically forms of media that have a new kind of a power feed that kind of sense of a crisis, right? So in the Civil War era, the telegraph was a new form of technology, and suddenly people could see across the nation things that seemed wrong or unfair or threatening in a way that they hadn't seen before. Civil rights era TV, broadcast to people, they could see what was happening. And now I think, you know, people's personal phones and social media are taking over the narrative in all kinds of interesting ways. And in a democratic republic, it's all about communication between the people and the people in power. So any of these forms of technologies are going to shape, I think, potentially dramatically what's going on. So I think we're in one of those moments. Those moments often have a threat of violence through them. I think more often than not, the Civil War is obviously one in which structures failed and we had a war. More often what happens is that the political process kicks in a way that people can sort of agree on in a general kind of a sense. So in other words, there's an election and people are willing to step back and see the outcome of the election. There's a Supreme Court decision. There's a piece of legislation. The actual formal system kicks in and does something formal that Americans are willing to step back and sort of accept in a provisional way and allow things to continue. That's certainly the way the founding generation envisioned it, you know, when they were creating the Constitution. We can't climb into their heads and know what they were thinking, but what we can know is that one of the things they thought they were doing very explicitly was creating a system that in a moment of crisis could always be resorted back to. That's right after the presidential election of 1800, when people were arming themselves in case the election went the wrong way. Someone asked Jefferson, what would have happened? What would you have done if things had gone the wrong way? And he said, well, we would have gotten together, maybe had another constitutional convention and gone back and fixed the system and then gone right back to where we were before. So that's an assumption. Now, we're in a moment when, you know, one of the things that's being exposed are problems in the system, number one. Number two, the administration in power has a conflicted, to be diplomatic about it, relationship with our constitutional system of governance. You put both of those things in play, and it becomes very hard to predict what's going to happen. So I think so many of us are in a position where we're thinking about the election in the fall and really don't know what's going to happen. And there's a lot of contingency there, right? So you can say, will we have elections? You know, is somehow the pandemic going to stop that from happening? If we have them, will they be free and fair elections? If they're free and fair elections, then what? Does it matter? You know, there's a lot of ifs coming into play with this coming election, which are a little more iffy than I guess sometimes these rectifying moments tend to be.
Okay.
When you're referring to citizenship, you're not referring to formal citizenship, right? You're referring to who exists or who is valued in a polity as a full member of that society.
And has rights.
And has rights. Interesting. So to follow up on that, to follow up in the context of rights and pushing for social justice, you referenced the Civil War and the unrest around the civil rights movement that brought about obviously dramatic change, right? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which didn't automatically really abolish slavery, as we know. If you've watched the 13th documentary, I think that lays out what scholars have been working on for decades. And then, of course, the civil rights, after the civil rights movement, we had two major pieces of legislation that protected rights, which haven't necessarily been enforced. And this is a really long way of asking a question about what we know about social movements, what we know about specifically social movements around the rights, and trying to to put an end to the dehumanization of Black Americans, this 400-year history. 7 years ago, the Black Lives Matter movement was started by Alizia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. And here, 7 years later, there's finally this burst of momentum around this issue and awareness. What can we learn from the past that can shed some light on why it took 7 years for BLM to have its moment? What is likely to happen with this, and best ways that people who are involved in the movement can actually advance social justice?
Okay, so I suppose the first half of that question, which is why now? I mean, I really do think there's a level of awareness right now among people, and it's an awareness among a population of white people who might not normally be aware of some of the inequity and some of the problems that are happening right now. And I do think that's partly a product of the pandemic. The historical parallel that I draw with that is, you know, I think about abolitionism and you know, before the Civil War, the fact that there were people who were very aggressively, adamantly against slavery. The vast majority of Americans were not. And one of the ways in which Americans got on board with being anti-slavery in some way wasn't because they suddenly had a moral reckoning and thought slavery was wrong. It was because people in national power emphasized the fact that their anti-slavery petitions in Congress were being ignored. So their right of petition was being violated. So their personal rights suddenly were being violated in a way that mattered to them. And then suddenly they were willing to take action because what had been a broad problem that they didn't connect to suddenly very much felt like a personal problem. And there were people, national politicians of various sorts, that very deliberately did that, were opposed to slavery and knew that the way to get the majority of Americans in line was to focus on a thing that they felt was affecting them. Their rights were being violated, and then they might step forward and act. So, you know, I think some of what's going on now relates to that, which is the fact that because of the blend of things that are all happening at once right now, I just think there's a population of white Americans who are seeing things and feeling things and seeing the impact of things and feeling the impact of things in a way that has goaded them into taking more action or being more aware than maybe they were likely to be otherwise. Now, I think history teaches that the most successful social movements, and this isn't going to be revealing in any way, but you know, the really successful social movements are ground up, grassroots, and very often involve young people, right? It's hardly a surprise. But what's related to that is, you know, I think looking at it in a really general way at how Americans have been responding to the series of crises we've been having, there is a tendency for some people to look to actually important white men, right? Save us. You know, save us, Mueller, you know, the report that will save us. That, you know, pick a person who is supposed to save us, and none of these people have saved us, and that's kind of not surprising because change ultimately won't start at that level. It'll start on a grassroots level. It'll start with people organizing, as they're beginning to do now for any number of reasons. That's the best way to make change, really, is for people to be organized, to have a sense that people around them, there are people around them that agree with them, that who are willing to act together. I mean, go all the way back, and how does the American Revolution get off the ground? It gets off the ground because there are groups of people who, in some way or another, feel that their rights are being violated and understand that there are others around them who agree with that and begin to talk together and drill together and talk about what action they'd be willing to take together. It's a ground level swell of energy that really has the power for change. So, you know, you think about our government and you almost can't help but think about it top down. But the fact of the matter is, a republic, a democratic republic, which is what we are, is grounded on public opinion. And whether the people in power acknowledge that or not, it's true. And, you know, if the public finds a way to voice their concerns or their fears or their demands, even now we're seeing that sometimes there's a response. We're seeing that happen actually now in real time. So I think that goes back to the idea that it's important to remember that this is a moment of contingency. It's tempting to think that, well, it doesn't matter what we say. Well, it does. You just have to say it in an organized way so that people can hear you and so that people understand it's not random people, but there's a force that has to be reckoned with. And power holders in a democratic republic have to reckon with that in one way or another. There can be negative and positive ways of reckoning with that, but it was a very long answer.
Oh, thank you. Very illuminating. And I know that I think Malik has a question about the pandemic, but it ties into that same way, right? About public accountability and how much power individuals have when they see that public officials are not responding to public opinion. Oh, I think you're muted, Malik.
I'm muted, which, you know, will delight many. Okay, so, yep, okay. So here, let's move forward that a bit here. So if you could, try to put the current COVID-19 pandemic into historical context for us. And so when in my classes, I often talk about the role that plagues and pandemics have had, the influence they've had over previous civilizations, transforming them radically. And I thought maybe you could talk about the way that pandemics in the US, like the 1918 Spanish flu, have affected our political landscape in the past, and how it might be shaping it today.
Well, part of the answer to that I sort of hinted at before, and I think that is crises generally, but I think pandemics specifically expose failures, right? Expose failures of government, failures of public health, failures of the government to address a problem, failures that are literally life and death as far as the American people are concerned. And they're failures that increasingly become impossible to ignore, although clearly people will always try to ignore or deny them. But regardless of that, I think moments like this, and this was true in 1918, and I think it's true now, people are once again looking for help or assistance, and the absence of it has an impact. Now in 1918, as today, in that case, I think it was a midterm election coming up. But again, it became a big question as to what was going to happen in the pending election. Would there be an election? If there was an election, how would it function? How would campaigning work? You know, some of the very same logistical questions got raised in 1918, but people understood, I think, in a general sort of a way, the significance of the election at that moment in time, probably in a way that they hadn't focused on before that point. And I think any American, regardless of their politics right now, is quite aware of the fact that this election is going to be vital, and that you know, voting and any number of other things is going to be supremely important. And in that sense, it is transformative. You know, it's kind of a positive and a negative at the same time for me. But one of the things that I kind of gives me some degree of hope in this moment is that probably to a greater degree than I've seen thus far in my lifetime, people, and especially young people, are so engaged with the political process, and they just aren't typically. I think Americans have often assumed the system goes of itself. It's a machine that goes of itself, and maybe you pay attention and maybe you don't, and maybe you vote and maybe you don't, and it just sort of percolates along. And I think we're in a moment where people realize that you can't take that for granted. And I think that's a huge realization. And so again, who knows what's going to happen next, but if one of the things that this moment brings is a wider awareness of the fact that democracy takes work, and it never goes by itself, and that you have to be aware and that you have to step forward, that would be invaluable. I mean, that all by itself, I think, would be transformative.
So to follow up on that, this idea of having to be vigilant in order to keep our democracy, Donald Trump has made no bones about, he has not hidden the fact that he is going against norms and traditions of the office, and that his relationship, I don't remember your polite way of saying it, but his relationship with the Constitution is a little loose. And so I was hoping you could speak more about that, right? What it means, and 240 years of a democratic republic, we've not had someone in this office who is violating norms and rules in the way that he is, whether, regardless of what political party you belong to. He actually takes pride in doing that. So if you could talk about that, and also his tenuous relationship with the Constitution, and what that means in terms of how citizens should be struggling to hold him and his administration accountable.
Well, you know, it's interesting. When this administration was really first registering what it was doing and how it was going to be doing it. So, you know, at Yale, I teach early American history, but among the things that I teach are the Constitution. And when I teach the Constitution, I say, so basically, this means almost every semester, certainly every year, I teach the fact that the Constitution is a framework of a government. It's if you think about what it does and the length of it, it's skeletal. And so for, you know, decades, I've been teaching the Constitution and saying so much of it relies on all the processes around the Constitution, norms and precedent and all of these other things. It's the beginning of a government, and the actual government is determined in practice. As much as I've said that, for as long as I've said it, I understand in a totally different kind of gut level way right now what the significance of those norms and what it means when they're violated. And I've heard other political historians say the same thing, which is, you know, which always makes me feel better. It's like, okay, I'm not the only one, you know, I'm not having a like naive realization if other senior people are saying, wow, like norms are so much more present and vital and so, in a sense, more easily violated and shredded than perhaps we have realized before. That we're getting a lesson in that all the time. And you know, early on, I think people were looking about and saying, oh, well, they can't do that, can they? And of course, the answer is, yeah, actually they can, because there's no constitutional provision against it, or there is one, but someone has to actually act on it, or whatever the list is. We're getting a daily lesson in all of the ways in which the constitutional system that generally has been a national pact that we all sort of bought into. What happens if someone doesn't buy into the pact in the same way? Well, we're kind of seeing that. You know, again, that's more of the sort of everything is contingent lesson. I don't know what happens in that kind of a case. We're seeing that, and it changes day by day.
Okay, interesting. So maybe we can move that into an even more concrete position. So getting involved in order to, you know, be engaged in the democracy and protect against, you know, wild abuses. A couple of our audience members have asked questions that I think will help us get at this. Malia asks, historically and presently, what have been the most effective forms of allyship in times of crisis? Or what are the best ways that historically would have worked well to band together and sort of put pressure on our representatives, on our government to get things done? Which is another way of asking the question that I wanted to ask you, which is, what can we be doing now? What does history tell us about what we can be doing now that has been effective, that might be effective?
Right. So I guess I will say a couple things. I will say in part, having groups of people that cross demographic lines come together and work towards change is major. Doesn't always happen. We're kind of watching some of that happen now. That's a major way in which we've seen change in the past. Also related to what I've said before, getting people who are not activists, are not inclined that way, are not normally engaged in the process to feel personally engaged in it. That's major. Not just because that might get people to vote, but because that actually might get people to act. And that's some of what we're seeing that's driving this ongoing protest, right? The ongoing demonstrations. Some of that is just a sense of a shared moment among a large group of people that hasn't traditionally come together in this way to this degree for this length of time before. And that really matters a lot. You know, I think something that the reason I initially took to Twitter, what got me on there was very early on during the presidential campaign, our last presidential campaign, I went on Twitter. I hadn't been using it very much. And I said, you know, in this campaign, there's a lot of discussion of the judicial branch and dismissing it or saying it's unimportant, or we don't need to worry about it, or we don't like these judges, so we shouldn't pay attention to them. And I said, you know, checks and balances really matter a lot. And I apologize for what I thought was the obviousness of this tweet. And I said, you know, every branch of government has a superpower. Each one matters and is relative to the other. And you can't ignore one and have the system still stand. And I explained that, and then I apologized at the end again and said, I'm sorry, that's obvious, I feel the need to say it. And what stunned me was the number of people who responded not knowing that. Thank you for explaining checks and balances. Thank you for explaining branches of government. And I realized, so in addition to the question of crossing demographic lines, another thing that I think it's really important to do now, and I think this is some of the work that we can be doing, and certainly some of the work that I'm trying to do, to get people to be aware of rights, right? And a violation of rights, like being aware of voter suppression, what it is, the right to vote, being aware of at least democratic ideals. They haven't necessarily been met, but it matters that they exist and that we can work towards meeting them. I just think that there's a general lack of awareness about how our system works in a general kind of a way, what the principles are that underlie it, what are the biggest threats against it. What kind of stuns me about this is that, you know, the founding generation, you can criticize them in a lot of ways, but one of the things that they said repeatedly was, for this to succeed, people are going to need to be educated about the system of government and what the major threats to it are. And so they talked about providing some form of public education because that's the only way the system can survive if Americans understand it. So as far as what people can do now, as a teacher, I think that's a major thing that needs to be happening, is people need to understand their rights, and people need to be pointing out when those rights are being violated. Because I just think people don't realize that. And once they're gone, once you surrender a right, it's going to be very hard to get that back. So I think that's a vital thing that people need to be thinking about and people need to be hearing about. So in addition to organizing on a ground level, crossing demographic lines, learning more about the system of government and how it works. And I know everyone is saying vote, but that's because it's true. This might be the most important election that many of us have experienced in our lifetimes, because I think, as much as I said, I don't necessarily think we're doomed. Democracy is being debated right now. And in some ways in the fall, we will be voting on some of the basic core elements of democracy. And that sounds dire, and it is. And I think I can't exaggerate the degree to which I think it's going to be important for people to step up and act and vote. And if they don't, I on a certain level, you know, contingency, I don't know what we're going to end up with, one way or another. And I don't think people fully realize that. I don't think people fully accept the degree to which things might change dramatically for the worse. Because I think American exceptionalism and the idea that it's always going to be okay is so deeply ingrained in people. I don't think they're able to grasp the degree in which that isn't necessarily true.
And what rights are you most concerned about losing? Have we lost rights already in the past few years, or are there specific rights that you think we should be flagging as being under threat?
Well, I mean, the most immediate one is obviously voting rights and voter suppression. And it's happening in a really obvious way. We've been watching all kinds of, I mean, just yesterday, right, in Georgia, we're watching all kinds of ways in which people are deliberately making it harder for people to vote. And they're strategically doing that in areas that are less white, right, to keep minority populations, make it harder for them to vote. That's an obvious ploy. So that's a right that I think is in danger. And I think in a way, that's the most fundamental right of all. If you don't have the right to step forward and shape the government, there are no rights to follow. And so for me right now, that feels like front and center. And the fact that this is such a dire election means we need to be thinking about it right now. That's the most important one. I mean, I think there are any number of others, and I think some are being debated, right? Healthcare, what kind of rights do people have to healthcare? Well, that's something people are talking about. As far as inclusiveness or exclusivity, put it that way, of government, right? Whose voice matters and what voices do we hear? there's an area in which I think it has been not operating sufficiently for a very long time. And some of what we're seeing right now, particularly in this moment, is recognition again and again and again of ways in which Black voices have not been heard, Black writers have not been paid or taken on, a lot of ways in which people have been silenced, and their right to contribute to a democratic conversation has been sort of quietly behind the scenes pushed off to the side. All of these are things, you know, holes and gaps and failings that are being exposed by all of these crises. And then the question is, you know, what are we going to do with this moment? And I wish I knew the answer to that.
A very brief follow-up question coming off of a very powerful question in our Q&A, which is, from a historical perspective, thinking about the structural elements, the racial slavery elements in the Constitution, to what extent do you see our democracy and the Constitution as being transformable, so that essentially the structure of it makes it possible to transform it and to continue to transform it? And in what ways, or do you think that there are things that cannot be transformed in that system?
Wow. Well, I would say in a general sense, I think it's transformable, but I don't think that's easy. And I think the deepest roots that we have as a nation connect to all of the ways in which we've been fostering inequality and putting one population above another. So we're talking about ideas on the one hand that are ideals to strive for, and on the other hand, ideals that have very definitely never been met. And those all go back to the dawn of the Republic. Can we move more towards the optimum and further away from the negative? Yes. Can we eliminate the sort of, racist lack of discrimination that's built into our system? I don't want to say we can't, but it's not going to happen without a lot of effort, and it's going to take time. And maybe this is a moment when people, oddly enough, as they feel in crisis, can see the possibility for change. I think there is a possibility for change. I think that should inspire us. But I think in the same way that people shouldn't think democracy happens all by itself, they should also not think that a little bit of awareness is going to fix that system. It's going to need concrete change. And it's going to take time, and it's going to require persistence.
Dr. Freeman, we have a number of questions coming in. So Professor Malik and I are going to do some rapid fire questioning. Mitchell Shipper has asked, as a result of social media, how much more concerned should we be about hostile foreign influence and disruption in our social and constitutional systems, and what can we do about it?
That's a really important question. One of the things as a historian that I'm really fascinated by is watching how technology shapes democracy, because it does. And before this moment, watching like when the Democrats in the House, I believe, had a gun control protest and the cameras were turned off, so they took out their cell phones and broadcast to the nation what they were doing with their phones. I stayed up, and that was till late hours of the night, and I stayed up and I watched that because I recognized that as a moment when technology was surpassing the media and giving a connection in a way that hadn't existed before. I've lost track of where I was going. Tell me the question again?
The question is about whether we should be more concerned with influence in our elections because of social media and what we can do about it.
Okay, so the short answer is yes. and I think the very things that offer the potential for communication and potential for organization and the ways in which people connect with each other obviously are also the very things that contain the biggest threat of disinformation, of propaganda, of all of these things that I think Americans, and not just Americans, people are not very good at detecting. It's not as though social media is new, but the way in which it is now a fundamental core central part of our political process, partly because the president uses it that way, that's something different. And, you know, as a historian, you know, as college professors, you do the same thing, which is try and teach your students to evaluate evidence. Think about where it comes from. Think about who's saying it. Think about if there's proof. I think that those are important skills, and I don't think they're skills that everybody has. So should we be worried about that? Yes. Should we be concerned about the fact that although people have been talking about that for months and months and months, it doesn't seem that any action's been taken on it? Yes. Now, I think, you know, do I have the answer to that? No. What I can say is, once again, it feels as though the only action right now that can be taken that might actually happen is local, is state level, is city level, is going to be people on a local level trying to act in a way that to the best of people's abilities makes these elections fair and leaves a trail. I don't know if that means a paper trail or not. You know, this is not my area of expertise, but we're not seeing that kind of energy on a national level. And so I think it's going to require action that should be happening now, right? We're not that far off from this election. So, you know, we've been watching these primaries and seeing things go wrong. We should be acting. And I understand that some of the difficulty of this moment is precisely because there are so many emergencies, so many fires that need to be put out that people can't address them all. But this is one that on a local level, local government, people need to be focused on in a concrete kind of a way.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna read a comment that's in our Q&A, powerful and very valid one, and we can comment on it as we go. So this person, and I don't know if they want their name used or not, so I'm not gonna use their name. I feel that it's important we acknowledge that white people are causing voter suppression. White people are causing the racial contention we're having, and white people are silencing the voices of people of color and Black people. Transformation will only come when white people admit that they are causing the inequalities that people of color and Black people are experiencing. And they're concerned that we're not directly using that language to confront that. I agree with that. So do you have any comment on that, or maybe when does that, you were talking about the Civil War and about how people could feel like when their rights were being curtailed, that they suddenly stepped forward. Do you have any thoughts beyond the obvious merit of the point?
Well, I mean,
yeah.
it's kind of the key point, right? I mean, that's part of why we are where we are. And it is, you know, the dynamics of this moment on lots of different levels is when people feel entitled to something and feel that what they're entitled to is being taken away, they can act in a desperate way. They can throw rules out the window, and they can grab at power in a way that allows them to feel that they're going to maintain control. And that's on a lot of levels what we're feeling right now, right? That's kind of the moment we're in, and we don't know whether the result will be transformation or entrenchment. We don't know. I think that is key. I think if we don't acknowledge that and accept that, that's not going to help serious transformation happen. I think that is one of the main keys. Do I have the answer about how to get people to acknowledge and own that? That I don't have the answer to, but I would agree that it's key. It's central. It's not the only problem, but it's the dynamic that's at the core of everything.
Questions come in from Karen Hannes. Is there a history of citizens believing alternative facts, which ties into the social media question earlier?
Well, you know, there has never been a moment when the press has been 100% reliable, right? You go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, and people were making things up and putting them in the newspapers. Objectivity initially wasn't even a goal. So I think it's not so much that we're in a moment when suddenly there are false facts. I think it's that we're seeing targeted, strategic, often outside boosted attempts to spread this kind of propaganda that is not necessarily unique to this moment, but distinctive to this moment. So it's not so much just the fake news, it's the fact that it's part of a deliberate political campaign in an aggressive kind of a way that is deploying the power of social media and the weaknesses of social media to spread its message. You know, any of us can see that happening all the time on Twitter and everywhere else. You can see things bouncing around that you know are not true. And, you know, what do? I was just sort of debating this the other day. Like, do you step forward and say, no, that's not true? You should, but in doing that, are you just also broadcasting the fake message? You know, it's a bind of a situation. And I wish I had the answer to a lot of these conflicts and sticking points. I don't. But the people who are asking these questions and identifying them are absolutely on target for the things that we're going to have to begin to address to allow for change, or that we ignore or deny at our peril, I think.
Okay.
I had a question about the mistakes of the past during pandemics. And if you see, or if you can think of any big mistakes that have happened in the past that you see are emerging now, or what we can expect in terms of anticipating the errors of the past reproducing themselves in the current context in the coming years?
Well, one answer I have for that is going to be obvious, but I think it's worth stating anyway. And that is, it's pandemic or any other kind of crisis. These are moments where it's easy for those in power, if they choose to fan the flames of crisis in order to take power or seize power or keep power. I think I keep using the word awareness. I think we need to be really aware of the dynamics of what's happening around us, who's telling us these things, what they're telling us these things for. Because I think it's too easy to get swept up in the emotion of what's going on right now and be swallowed up at a moment when we can possibly move towards change. So I think that's just as true in the past as it is now. I think that, you know, I don't want to say evil. The idea of inflaming a crisis to seize power it has a logic to it and is as anti-democratic in a sense as you can be. I'd say that's a lesson of the past that we ought to be thinking about at present.
So one last from me about, maybe we can all discuss it in our experience and we can think about it in historical context too, which is there's a lot of petitions out right now, a lot of like, you know, these sort of like online, because a lot of us limited to being online. What effect do they still have an effect? And I'll just say in like 3 seconds, there was a period where sending email blasts out to your elected representatives to get them to act in a certain way worked, and then it just became spam. Right. And so the question is, do we still think that these kinds of petitions are effective? Are there things historically in situations like this that are more effective, given that many people can't be out knocking on doors and so on?
Well, I do think that quantity matters. You know, like when healthcare was really on the table and people were saying, call your representatives. And we saw how to some degree the number of phone calls, the amount of activity didn't necessarily have a transformative effect, but it had an impact. So, you know, can I say petitioning absolutely matters, and do I have any kind of ability to back that up? No. But I think if there are big, widespread petitions that reveal vast numbers of people as a way of indicating and measuring public opinion in the same way that, you know, people respond to swells of a response on Twitter, right? We see that there's, you know, something happens on Twitter and then there's like a formal response. People lose jobs or whatever it is that happens. If there's a sense that a petition really honestly reflects widespread sentiment in some way, and if that can be registered in some way, I do think that still matters. I do think that that counts as a fundamental right. I do think that the right of petition and the right of protest, there's a reason why those are two of the fundamental rights that date back to the beginning of the Republic. Those are two of the fundamental ways in which people can make their demands known, and that's part of the definition of a democracy.
On that note, thank you so much, Dr. Freeman. We want everyone to check out your Thursday morning Zoom program, sponsored by the National Council for History Education. So tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so a little earlier for us West Coasters, but we'll wake up. The title is History Matters and So Does Coffee. So fully behind the title and the sentiment. And Dr. Freeman in this weekly webinar talks about how we look at the past, how that can help us better understand the present. And it's my understanding that you're delving into, and your pattern is delving into one topic each week, right? Can you tell us what your topic will be tomorrow?
Yeah, so yeah, every week I pick some aspect of the past. Last week I talked about women in resistance in the past. One week I talked about ground level actors who aren't big names and the kinds of change that they can have. I talked about contingency. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the ways in which images can have a real kind of gut level power, politically and otherwise. I'm going to talk about a document I once found from the 1790s, someone really talking about the profound influence of just seeing a wall full of people who fought in the American Revolution that they hadn't realized that there were that many people who had done it, and this person sort of testifies to the power that that has. And then I'm going to pivot and talk about how many of the images that we're seeing now, the kind of power that they have, and how it's easy to take that for granted, but we shouldn't.
I know I'll be tuning in. And we will be having these Matrix webinars throughout the summer. Hopefully everyone who has joined us today will join us throughout the summer, and we'll make these available, recordings available via our website. Our next CTSJ Matrix webinar is on June 22nd, and that's with Maritza Agundez of Churla, and she will be discussing the impact of the COVID pandemic and crisis on immigrant communities. We hope that you join us, and again, thank you, Dr. Freeman, and have a wonderful rest of your week and analysis and protest and keeping as safe as we all possibly can from the pandemic.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Joanne.